Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the history of Kashmir, which is a contested state between India and Pakistan. It has a very complex history. And in order to help us understand that complex history, we're joined by noted Professor Christopher Snedden, who is a scholar, researcher, historian of South Asian history and politics, but he specializes in Kashmir. Is that correct, Professor Snedden?
It is indeed, Sadat. Thank you very much. Yes, that's correct.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I know you have a very passionate interest in this topic. It's not strictly academic for you. I think it's more than that. And actually, I wanted to start by asking you, like, how did you develop this interest in this part of the world? How did that happen? And I know that you've spent some time visiting Kashmir too. So how many times have you done that?
Well, I first became involved in India in 1981. I first went to India in 1981, and I went to study meditation actually in an Indian ashram. I then joined the Australian Department of Defence in 1983. 1984, I was in their intelligence wing called the Joint Intelligence Organisation. And the first briefing I ever gave was about the hanging of Makbul Butt. And because of my interest in South Asia, I actually studied Russian and I wanted to go onto the Soviet desk, but it was too popular. So I went across to look at South Asia, in which I was terribly interested and still am. And so I continued to look at South Asia on and off. And then I wanted to upgrade my qualifications. My wife and I wanted to do that. And so in the 90s, mid-90s, I moved from Sydney to Melbourne and decided to do a PhD at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And I thought, what I really want to do is the Kashmir dispute because it's so long, so important. India and Pakistan, we thought were getting nuclear weapons, which was confirmed in 1999. And so a flashpoint, there's been a number of wars between them over this disputed territory and so on and so forth. I first went to Kashmir in 1996. I first went to India in 81, Pakistan in 1984, the Kashmir Valley in 1996, which was very significant because there were only 2 hotels for foreigners open there then, and I didn't see any other foreigners when I was there. I went in March, and it was the militants controlled the town at night, Srinagar, and during the day the Indian paramilitary forces were in charge, and there was a lot of tension, a lot of angst. When I was there, there were about 30 militants killed, not in Hazrat Bar, which is a very significant shrine for Kashmiris, where there's a hair of the Prophet, a relic that they revere, but very close by, and I heard that. And so I then went across to the other side, to Azad Kashmir, which Pakistan administers. And I've been to all of the areas of Jammu and Kashmir over the years, except actually for Gilgit-Baltistan. So I haven't been there for a few years, unfortunately, and it's a little bit tricky for me now because of what's happened since 2019. I'm not sure the Indian government would welcome a visit by me to the Kashmir Valley. I don't know, I haven't actually tested that, but I still remain very interested in that part of the world.
So, I mean, from my perspective as a layperson, what I know is that Kashmir, of course, was a predominantly Muslim populated region or state. And so in 1947, but Kashmir had a Hindu king or Maharaja. And so it was in dispute as to whether Kashmir should go to predominantly Hindu India or predominantly Muslim Pakistan. And so part of it now is controlled by Pakistan, part of it is controlled by India, and its future is kind of up in limbo. As you know, the main trigger that made me interested in calling you and having this conversation about Kashmir was the release of an Indian film some months ago called The Kashmir Files. And so this film, which was a massive hit in India at the box office, it has re-triggered people's interest in the issue of Kashmir. However, this film, which I believe you've viewed now as well, it presents a kind of a very simplistic view of what's happening in Kashmir. I felt we all have our various biases. As you know, I'm Muslim myself. So my feeling watching that film was that the Kashmiri Muslims were portrayed completely as evil and demonic, and there was literally not one good character that I recall. I don't think there was one good Kashmiri Muslim character, which is strange when the backdrop of the film is Kashmir. So that would, just to give our viewers a kind of an idea, that would be like an American film where all of the Black characters in the film, all of them without exception, happen to be villains. That would raise some eyebrows, and that would stir some debate and disagreement and discussion about that. So traditionally in Indian films, you always had a good Muslim character. In this one, they're all portrayed as demonic. And the feeling that you get watching that film, and many younger Indians who have not bothered to do the kind of research that you have done, they walk away with the feeling that not only are the Kashmiri Hindu Pandits the main victims of that conflict, but maybe even the sole victims of that conflict. So I know that's a lot to unpack, but you can start wherever you'd like to start. And I mean, what were your kind of views on the film before we go into a general history of Kashmir and more about the general issue of Kashmir? What were your feelings as a scholar when you watched that film?
Well, as a human being, I really disliked that movie because the violence it portrayed was absolutely awful. As a scholar, it was a very one-sided view, not necessarily unrealistic, but very one-sided and unbalanced. Many of those things that they portrayed in that movie did actually happen to some pundits. Not all pundits, but some of those Hindu Kashmiris, many of whom left in 1990 and thereafter. However, it didn't, as you said actually, Sadat, it didn't show anything to do with some of the good Muslims, and there were and still are Muslims in the Kashmir Valley who want these pundits to come back and who are very sad that they left in the first place, and some of whom helped those pundits either to avoid being attacked by militants or to leave the Kashmir Valley, believing that they would come back soon. Both the Muslims and the pundits, the Hindu pundits, believed they would come back to the valley soon. And the third thing was that some of those Muslims also looked after the pundit property. So none of that was portrayed in that film. So it does show one very narrow aspect of what happened, as I said, to some pundits, but it was very unbalanced. And to do a movie that's balanced about Jammu and Kashmir is very problematic. And it would be very, very lengthy by the time you portrayed all points of view, because there were certainly some militants who were very pro-Pakistan or pro-Azadi, by which they mean freedom or independence. There were also some who were pro-Indian, like the Abdullahs, who were both Farooq and his son Omar have been chief ministers of Indian Jammu and Kashmir, which is what I call it, so Ladakh, Jammu and the Kashmir Valley. And there's lots in between. And to get all of those points of view in there would be very difficult. And Islam, while the Kashmir Valley is strongly, almost now 100% Muslim, those Muslims, there's various types of Muslims as well. There's some who are Islamists, who are very hard line. There are some on the other extreme who are Sufi inspired, who are very generous and inclusive. And in between, you've also got Sunnis and Shias and various other people. And there is this concept within the Kashmir Valley of Kashmiriyat, which means Kashmiriness, that basically respects unity, but also diversity, and is inclusive. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're a Kashmiri, you're welcome in the valley. Remembering, of course, that there are some Sikhs in the Kashmir Valley as well. In 1947, about 2% of the population were Sikhs, about 5.4% were Hindu Pandits. So they're not all Muslims in the Kashmir Valley. There are these other minorities. So it was very selective in what it portrayed in terms of Kashmir. And the final scene I just found absolutely heart-wrenching, because unfortunately that did actually happen. There were 24 Hindu Pandits massacred in a place called Nadimarg on the 23rd of March 2003. And there has been violence against Hindu Pandits. There's also been some violence against Sikhs. But out of the 50 to 100,000 people killed, the majority of those are actually Muslims, and Muslims have also suffered because of this anti-India uprising, this militancy. And in 1996, when I went there, they were under stress because of the Indian army and paramilitary that were trying to suppress and control their area. And then at night, under stress because they couldn't go out because the militants were controlling the streets. And they were they were in the middle of the sandwich, and they were being exploited and to some extent intimidated by growth groups. Militants were trying to get money and support out of it. The Indian paramilitary forces were trying to get their emotional support and their political support. So it's been a very difficult problem for all people. They're very stressful.
Right. And just to kind of make my position clear for people who are maybe watching this channel for the first time and they don't know where I stand on these kinds of issues, for me in general, I would condemn any kind of wrongful, oppressive violence against any civilians or innocent people. And that's not just theoretical. I absolutely acknowledge that the the Kashmiri Pandit Hindu minority in Kashmir came under immense pressure, that there were cold-blooded killings. And many of them, in fact, the majority of them, also because I think they were in a position, a financial position or influential position to be able to do so, many of them understandably chose to leave the Kashmiri Valley for greener pastures, for other safer parts of India until Kashmir, settles down. So that of course is wrong. And, any decent human being from any religious background, I think, should condemn that. But at the same time, and you're correct in saying that the events depicted in that film, those individual acts of violence actually did happen. The director has made the point of saying that everything that we showed in that film is documented and actually happened. But my complaint, I guess, is that when you fail to show the larger political social backdrop or context to those things, it leaves the person with the impression, as I said, that this is like some kind of one-sided thing where demonic Kashmiri Muslims are just trying to annihilate all the Hindus in Kashmir. And it's not quite that simplistic. As you said, of the up to 100,000 casualties of the Kashmiri conflict, I think you said most of them were Muslim victims.
Yeah, most. Certainly the figures for the Pandits is quite interesting, actually, because Mr. Agnihotri, the director of that movie, The Kashmir Files, claims that there have been 4,000 Pandits killed. There was a question put in the Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly in 2010 as to how many Pandits had been actually killed. And the official version is that there's been only 219 Pandits killed between 1989 and 2004. So there's some, maybe those figures are understated, the official figures, but I think Mr. Agnihotri's figures may also be inflated. So like all things to do with India, Pakistan, Kashmir, finding the actual truth is very difficult. But there was a lot of violence, and in 1990, when the Pandits decided to leave, they were under significant pressure, funnily enough, by a group that called itself a secular group, and that was the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, which in those days was to the forefront of the insurgency. They were the ones who started it in 1988 with the bombing of the telegraph office in Srinagar in June, I think it was. And they were the ones that the Pakistanis initially supported because they were the best organised and they believed there should be guerrilla war. So in 1990, perhaps a lot of the anti-Pandit activity was by these so-called secular Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, although that massacre that I mentioned was by Lashkar-e-Toiba, because over time there were a lot of militant groups, and over time they essentially coalesced into three groups: the Hizbul Mujahideen, which was largely Kashmiri-based, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which had a lot of what the Kashmiris called foreign fighters, so people from outside Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. But in the interim, it was these secular JKLF people who want independence for all of Jammu and Kashmir who put these Kashmiris under pressure. But there's more to it than that, the Kashmiri Pandits under pressure. There's more to it than that. The governor at the time Jagmohan Malhotra, usually called just Jagmohan, had been reimposed. He'd previously been the governor during the 80s. He came back for about 4 or 5 months, and he apparently also encouraged, in inverted commas, the Kashmiri Pandits to leave. And they were given succour to get out and assistance to get out, and many went to Jammu, some went to New Delhi and other parts. But also during that time, some of the Kashmiri Muslims also were leaving. The business families, for example, sent some of their sons to other parts of India to get them out of the valley where it was so diabolical, and also to ensure that their businesses could continue to trade, because tourism, which has always been a major source of income in the Kashmir Valley, had dropped dramatically because of this uprising. So it's quite a complex situation.
Yeah, and the reason I'm repeating what you said is just to make sure that I've understood it correctly too. So Jagmohan Malhotra, the governor at the time of Kashmir, he is a Hindu, and he was encouraging some of those Kashmiri Hindu Pandit families to flee. And again, this just shows you how complicated and how messy the situation is, because that means that if today's BJP or some of the right-wing Hindus in India today want to argue that the exodus of Kashmiri Hindu Pandits from Kashmir constitutes a genocide or an ethnic cleansing, this would raise the problematic question of, was the Hindu governor Jagmohan part and parcel of or encouraging that ethnic cleansing of Hindus from Kashmir? Or
no, he certainly wasn't encouraging the ethnic cleansing of Hindu Kashmiris. He was trying to protect them, and by doing that, he said the best way to do so is for you to leave temporarily and then come back. When things have returned to normal, and when we, the Indians, have got this uprising not only under control but have suppressed it. Now, I thought the issue of genocide might come up, so I've got a definition. And according to some dictionaries, the definition of genocide, and I'm going to quote here, is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Now, the deliberate killing of a large number of people, yes, there may have been deliberate killings, but there wasn't a large number of people killed, I don't think. They were repatriated, if you like. Repatriated is not the right word. They were moved from the Kashmir Valley to parts of India to protect them and preserve them, with the belief that they would soon go back. And as I said earlier, there are people in the Kashmir Valley, including the Mirwais, who's the local religious leader, and the former Chief Minister, Dr. Farooq Abdullah, who yesterday said, we want these Kashmiri Pandits back. We're incomplete. They're our brothers, is what he called them, and we want them back. So genocide is not the right word. Interreligious brutality, yes. Interreligious violence, yes. And there's a history of that in Kashmir. There was a massive amount of interreligious violence in the Jammu province in 1947 between pro-India Sikhs and Hindus who wanted Jammu and Kashmir to join India, and pro-Pakistan Muslims who wanted Jammu and Kashmir to join Pakistan. As a result of that, all religious communities suffered, but Muslims more than others. And a number went to Pakistan at that time, believing that they would soon return back to Jammu and vote in the plebiscite, which would then resolve the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. So generally speaking, though, the Kashmir Valley has been quite peaceful until 1988-89, when this violent uprising, anti-India uprising, started. And that's when that unleashed this violence. But that said, also, there has on occasions been tensions between Hindus and Muslims in the Kashmir Valley. Yes, they've got along fairly well. They used to celebrate each other's religious holidays. The Muslims don't eat beef. The Kashmiri Hindus don't eat pork out of respect for one another. And the Hindus, surprisingly, because they're Brahmins, are actually non-vegetarian. They do take meat, which is unusual for Brahmins in India. So there was quite a lot of contact, but the Hindu Pandits were significant because many of them were very influential because they were bureaucrats in the Dogra regime under Hari Singh and his forebears. And so they, on occasions, exploited some Muslims who didn't have the same levels of education that the Kashmiri Hindus had, and didn't have the aspiration to be in the bureaucracy the way the Kashmiri Hindus had. So there was, on occasions, tensions, but equally, within the Kashmir Valley, there was also tensions between Muslims. There were, on occasions, problems between the Sunnis and the Shias for religious reasons, contestations and rivalry and so on and so forth. So you can't look at these things as a monolith. When you bore down, you'll see all sorts of differences and different experiences.
Coming back to Governor Jagmohan just for a moment, a more cynical view has it that one of the reasons that he was encouraging Kashmiri Hindu Pandits to flee was so that he could exact retribution and be able to discriminate between Hindus and Muslims more easily, identify the Kashmiri Muslim population more easily in order to exact retribution against them. What are your thoughts of that view?
Well, I don't think that has much credibility, actually, Sadat, because it's quite easy to pick a Kashmiri Muslim and a Kashmiri Hindu. Just ask them their name for a start. Hindus still have Hindu names. Kashmiri Muslims invariably have a Muslim name. To some extent, they had some slight differences in dress, particularly when they used to wear turbans and pagris. They used to tie them differently and so on and so forth. But most of the Pandits used to live together, although they were also, some of them, dispersed throughout the Muslim community. It would have been fairly easy for those in the know, and the Indian intelligence services are in the know in the Kashmir Valley to know where the Muslims were.
You answered one of the questions I wanted to ask, which was that, I mean, in that film, in the Kashmiri Files, again, I think this was a very simplistic film. They tried to simplify a very complex problem. And I took note of what you said. Of course, it would not be possible in a 2-hour or 3-hour film to summarize and do justice to all of those complex issues that are involved. Nonetheless, I know that in the past, in the 90s, they made several films that had a Kashmiri political backdrop to it. And there was definitely more nuance to those films than there was in this one. I mean, they were willing to show, for example, that the Indian state or the Indian State Army has made some mistakes, and these mistakes may have contributed to the resentment of some militant extremist elements, but these extremist militant elements don't speak for the whole of the Kashmiri populace. It's very possible to get that message through even in 2 or 3 hours. But in this film, in the Kashmiri Files, they very much tried to show that the only reason for this conflict or this hate is religion, pure and simple. It's purely religious. However, earlier on, you did speak about the culture of Kashmiriyat or Kashmiriness, that the people of that region, Muslim and Hindu and Sikh alike, do have an idea of their distinctness, whether it be their cuisine, their music, their dress, their poetry, their history. They have a unique and a distinct history. So that leads to my next question, which is that, are there Kashmiri Hindus or Kashmiri Sikhs who also champion the cause of Kashmiri separatism, who would also like to have an independent Kashmiri state? Does that exist in any kind of sizable number, or is that negligible, or does it not exist?
I would say negligible to not existing. That's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever been asked that one before, Sadat, so congratulations to you. But I haven't met any Kashmiri Hindus or Sikhs who've said that they want either independence or to join Pakistan. It's usually been Kashmiris, yeah. And not necessarily Kashmiris in the Kashmir Valley. Now, Makbul Bhatt, who was hanged in 1983, he was a Kashmiri, an ethnic Kashmiri from the valley. But the other fellow, along with him, who formed the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front in Birmingham in some period of time beforehand, Mr. Khan, he was ethnically a Kashmiri, but he came from Gilgit-Baltistan. So Yasin Malik, the current leader of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, who's in jail in New Delhi, he is an ethnic Kashmiri. So most of the people I think who've been in favour of independence for Kashmir have been Kashmiri Muslims, in my experience.
Right, right. There is an interesting example. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, Professor Natasha Kol. She is of Hindu Pandit ancestry. She's a professor in America of, I believe, South Asian studies as well. And she's been quite outspoken about Indian human rights abuses against the Kashmiris in general. And of course, I would not deduce from that that she must be a Kashmiri separatist as well. That may not be the case at all. But have there been Kashmiri Hindus who have also spoken up or protested in any way some of the heavy-handedness of the Indian government, of the Indian states in Kashmir, or not so much?
Well, yes, there have been. I can't give you chapter and verse. I can't give you a list of them off the top of my head, but there have been. Not just Kashmiri Hindus, but also other Hindus. For example, the Kashmir Times it's Jammu and Kashmir's oldest English language daily. The editor of that has been Anuradha Basin, has been very strongly in support of people, regardless of their religion, being treated fairly and given their rights. And there have been. The Human Rights Commission in India, which has a variety of people, including people who are Hindus and Muslims and so on and so forth, has also been very supportive of human rights and against violations thereof in the Kashmir Valley. So again, you just can't say all Indian Hindus are anti-Kashmiri or whatever it may be. There are some who are, and there are many who aren't.
Are there pressures on academic freedom and intellectual freedom on the people there in Kashmir, and by extension, other scholars of other ethnicities and other countries, and like people like yourself who write on this very contentious topic? Do you receive hate mail? Do you receive mail or messages from people from either side who say that you are, I don't know, not doing this issue justice? And I mean, I admit I'm very curious about whether you get any kind of messages from right-wing Hindus or Hindutva kind of people, but at the same time, if you get messages from Muslims or extremist Muslims, I would be curious to know.
No, I haven't. Generally speaking, when I go to Pakistan, people consider me either pro-India or anti-Pakistan. And when I go to India, the reverse happens. People consider me pro-Pakistan or anti-India, which suggests to me that perhaps I'm in the middle somewhere, I'm balanced. Now, in terms of who I support in the Kashmir dispute, I like India and I like Indians. I like Pakistan and I like Pakistanis. I also like people in Jammu and Kashmir. And if I support anybody in this dispute, it's the people of Jammu and Kashmir. They would be my, if you like, constituency, because I think they haven't been treated very well over the years. And both India and Pakistan are very paternalistic, patriarchal in the way they deal with this particular issue. They have decided that it's an issue between India and Pakistan to be resolved by India and Pakistan. I actually think there's now 3 Kashmir disputes. There's the territorial dispute between India and Pakistan over which should possess Jammu and Kashmir. There's the dispute between the people of the Kashmir Valley and New Delhi as to how much autonomy or not they should be given. And that, of course, has since been taken away since 2019. And there's a third dispute within the valley itself as to whether Kashmiris should unite with Pakistan, seek independence, or stay with India. And in terms of a resolution to all, but certainly the first one, the territorial dispute, the only way, I believe, is to ask the people of Jammu and Kashmir what they want. And nobody has ever done that in any meaningful, inclusive way. Now, India says the J&K Constituent Assembly that came into being in the 1950s and then developed the J&K Constitution did speak for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. But the election that voted in that Constituent Assembly was fairly substantially rigged. Almost all people were elected unopposed, and those who weren't, there was significant political pressure on them to elect a certain candidate. And it didn't include any representatives from Azad, Jammu and Kashmir or Gilgit-Baltistan, those two areas that Pakistan administered. So it's not a totally inclusive or representative body. But apart from that, there's been no consultation, and India and Pakistan have been very heavy-handed in the way, I believe, that they have dealt with the people of Jammu and Kashmir. The most recent example being 2019, when India did what it did in terms of abrogating Article 370 and Article 35A in India and Jammu and Kashmir. There was no consultation beforehand. They just essentially used some devices to get this legislation through Parliament. In other words, the President, who was in charge of Jammu and Kashmir because they'd suspended the Parliament and put in Governor's rule, which then after a period of time became President's rule, and the President essentially consulted himself, and as a result, they had these acts in Parliament that got rid of Article 370 and also vicariously Article 35A. And the Article 370 says that the Constituent Assembly is really the only body that can get rid of that particular article. And of course, it had stopped operating by the time I think the Legislative Assembly came into power in 1957 or 8. And so it's a vexed question. And the Indian Supreme Court is going to now look at these things, but what they decide will be very interesting. So, yes, long answer to your short question.
This Article 370, for my benefit and for the benefit of other viewers, which the Modi government in India revoked, what exactly did that article do? From what I understand, it gave some kind of semi-autonomous rights to Kashmir and recognized it as a kind of a unique state there. Is that it?
Yes, supposedly Jammu and Kashmir only acceded to India control of foreign affairs, defence and communications. This was supposed to be special, although that's the same situation for all princely states that acceded to India. Now, there were almost all princely states joined India in 1947, usually for geographic reasons. They were surrounded by Indian territory. 14, I think, joined Pakistan for the same reason. But they all, there were only about 140 princes out of about 560 who were entitled to make an accession. And all of them actually only acceded on foreign affairs and defence, so there was nothing unusual. But Article 370 was put into place by Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. And essentially that was designed to make Kashmiris in particular, but the people of Jammu and Kashmir, happy to be with India because they had this essentially a special status that no other part of India had. And that became problematic, though, after the Indian Constitution came into being. By 1953, Sheikh Abdullah, the leading Kashmiri politician, was questioning Jammu and Kashmir's involvement with India, its accession to India, and he was sacked on the 8th of August 1953, and thereafter there were some very pro-Indian Kashmiri Muslim politicians who ensured that Jammu and Kashmir moved administratively, economically, politically much closer to India. And things like the Indian Supreme Court took over as the highest court of appeal. The president was entitled to impose president's rule should there be political upheaval within India and Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian Administrative Service was imposed as the senior bureaucratic organisation, and so on and so forth. So that became diluted, that autonomy, to the point where it was largely symbolic. But that symbolism was very important to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, particularly Kashmiris, because they felt they had this separate status. Now, on the other hand, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which won government in 2014, had always made it very clear, both in their electoral manifestos in 2014 and 2019, that they wanted Article 370 removed. They thought this was not acceptable, that everybody should be Indians first and foremost, and then thereafter they could be Gujaratis or Kashmiris or Bengalis or whatever it might be. And they did when they took power in 2019, very quickly. they got rid of Article 370, which took away that special status now. People like Farooq Abdullah and his son Omar and Mehboob Mufti, who are three pro-Indian politicians who, surprisingly, after 2019 were put under house arrest, even though they were pro-Indian, want that reinstituted. So it's an ongoing issue, but it seems highly unlikely that it will be reinstituted while ever the BJP is in power. The only way it might be reinstituted is if the Supreme Court say it was illegal, what the BJP government did, or if there's a change of government. Because the BJP want these people to be Indians. And that's really the part of the crux of this issue. How do you accommodate Kashmiri identity within India? Or if Pakistan was in charge, within Pakistan. Kashmiri identity is very old. In fact, it's a lot older than either the post-British Indian identity or the Pakistani identity. It goes back for eons, really, centuries. And there's been a Sultan of Kashmir who was in place from the 1300s onwards until the Mughals captured Kashmir in 1586 and then started to reintegrate it. So the Kashmiri identity is very strong, and that's the challenge for India.
This might be a good opportunity for me to ask a question about the older history or the medieval history of Kashmir, because another point that was made in that film, The Kashmir Files, by some of the Kashmiri Pandits who were talking with one another, is that they had all been forced to convert to Islam, that the Hindu Pandits had been historically forced to become Muslim. So, I mean, does your knowledge of Kashmir go that far back? And how much of it is it that we can actually ascertain, and how much of it can we not? To what extent is forcible conversion a part of what happened historically? Is that all there is to it, or is that part of it? I mean, is that something that you have looked into or something that you know about?
Yes, Islam, yes, I have looked at it. Islam arrived from about the 1300s on, and maybe as early as the 1200s on. And by sort of the late 1300s, the majority of people in the Kashmir Valley had become Muslims. Now, in those days, most became Muslims because of people like Shah Hamadan and some other Sufis who arrived and essentially inspired people to become Muslim through their own character, through what they were propagating, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't done violently, although one of the first sultans of Kashmir was a religious zealot, and he did destroy a number of Hindu temples and imposed taxes on the non-Muslims, and was very fundamental, I suppose, is one way we would now call him. But his son, who was called Badshah, the great ruler, he ruled for almost 50 years and totally reversed all of those policies and was very religiously tolerant. Although a Muslim himself, he celebrated Hindu festivals and this, that, and the other. So he reversed all of that. But over time, Kashmiris to become Muslims, and that 5% or so remained Hindus, the Pandits. So it was basically a peaceful process, is my understanding.
Just a couple of other questions of points, please, that were brought up in that film. In terms of the human rights abuses or atrocities that are being done by the Indian state against the Kashmiri populace as a whole, I think one of the only mentions in that film was of the internet ban since 2019, since this Article 370 was revoked. So it gives one the impression that, like, the worst thing that the Kashmiris have had to go through, or the worst retribution that they have faced from the Indian state, is that they're not getting the internet. What is your understanding of that issue? Is that still in effect right now? Is there still an internet blackout in Kashmir right now? And if there is there a reason that the world is not making more noise about this? Like, should that be concerning us in this modern day and age when internet is completely shut off?
Yes, it is a concern, and it was a concern after the Indians imposed their will in 2019 because of things like education and medicine, that because they didn't have any internet, they weren't able to do any of those things, including internet banking, which increasingly is becoming popular in all parts of the world, including in India. So they were severely disadvantaged because of that. After they abrogated Article 372, they injected another 38,000, I think, paramilitary into the Kashmir Valley to suppress and control and make sure that nothing happened there untoward. And so people were largely confined to their houses, which confinement was made even worse because of COVID, where we were all encouraged to socially isolate. And so that was a problem. Then they did eventually start to restore the internet to the Kashmir Valley, but initially only with 2G, not 4G. So the speeds were very low and it gave them some access, but not a lot of access. It's also very difficult to know what's going on up there, because also what they did after 2019 was change the way that newspapers were able to report. And they did this by saying to the newspapers, you and your personnel have to be essentially reaccredited every 2 years. And if you don't report basically positive news about what's going on in Jammu and Kashmir, we will revoke your license and you won't be able to print or publish anything at all. So it's very hard to get a realistic position about what's going on in the Kashmir Valley. Indian journalists have tended over time to be very pro-Indian. They haven't always reported what Kashmiris have been saying or doing and what's been going on there. It's always been slanted. And this is a criticism raised by an Indian journalist, not me. This is Tavleen Singh, who wrote a book about Kashmir, and she said that most Indian journalists are quite pro-India. So it's very hard to understand what's going on up there, but I think people are suppressed and they are repressed and perhaps a bit also depressed because of what's been happening. Very tightly controlled. There's not a lot of protests going on up there, or if they are, they're not terribly well reported. And I think the Kashmir anti-India uprising is going through a little bit of a pause while everybody draws breath and sees what's going to happen as a result of the abrogation of Article 370, as a result of the abrogation of Article 35A, which allowed Kashmiris and people from Jammu and Kashmir, citizens, state subjects, only to buy land there. Now that's been abrogated, and we are seeing some non-J&Kites, I call them, non-people from those areas coming in and buying land. Although, interestingly, the figures that I've seen suggest more of this is happening in Jammu, where people are very pro-Indian, not in the Kashmir Valley. And of course, it also requires local people to sell their land to these foreigners, if you like, these interlopers, these outsiders. So there's that issue as well. So there have been human rights violations, no doubt, but and the Human Rights Commission has reported about them. There was a very significant report that came out in 2019, actually, about some of these challenges in Jammu and Kashmir, particularly in the Kashmir Valley.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that concerns me very much is a statistic that I came across whereby something like 1 in 6 Kashmiri women claim to have been sexually abused, if not raped, abused or something like this. There have been about 17,000 suicides by Kashmiri women since the 1990s up until the present time. So as you said, like if some of us are feeling the blues under COVID, the additional kind of security measures, oppressive measures that are being put in place there in Kashmir, you can imagine how it adds up to a lot of depression and anxiety amongst the people.
Enormous anxiety. And in years gone by, the Indian paramilitary forces used to conduct cordon and search operations, they were called. They would go into an area of, say, Srinagar or Anantnag, one of the bigger cities, and cordon it off and take all of the men away, and the women would remain in the house. And while the men were taken away, the men would be run past a number of vehicles called gypsies, which is a small armoured vehicle in which there would be a militant who the Indians had captured, and that militant would have to identify other militants. So very stressful for the men. And if those men were identified as a militant, even if they were or weren't, They were then taken away, and the best they could expect was a beating, with the worst being death, or in between torture and various other things. But while those men were taken away, men and boys, I think it was anybody over 14, the women were subjected to Indian paramilitary coming in and searching those houses, and some of those incidents of molestation, rape, etc., occurred then. And I don't know that there's been many, if any, Indian paramilitary convicted for allegations of molesting women and so on and so forth. And the Indians have a number of very powerful acts in place that basically allow the paramilitary and the military to operate with impunity, and that's been a significant issue as well. That also relates to another issue. The people who've borne the brunt of this insurgency have actually been women. The psychological disease has gone up dramatically, exponentially in Jammu and Kashmir since this uprising, and women have borne the brunt, partly because they're women, and it seems women are fair game in war. If you can do things to your opponent's females that makes them look weaker and you stronger. And also because people are being killed, mostly men, and women have become what they call half widows. They don't know if their husband is alive or dead. They haven't been able to find the body and deal with that or grieve or whatever. And there's that issue as well. Plus, women who run the houses have found that itself also difficult. There used to be so many strikes, hartals they call them, where the shops would shut, and you had to be very well organised to be able to deal with all of that. So to feed your family, electricity was intermittent, and that continues to be a problem at the moment in India, and also in Jammu and Kashmir, large periods of load shedding when there's no power available, which is difficult if you're trying to cook, keep warm, and so on and so forth. So women have suffered more, I think, on the scales of relativity than men as a result of this uprising.
Right, because they're left to kind of try to pick up the pieces and put their lives together when the men are missing. And in terms of men missing, because you mentioned not knowing the status of the men, whether they're dead or alive, whether they're in jail, do we have some kind of estimate number of how many Kashmiri Muslim men are missing or reported missing? Are we talking in the dozens? Are we talking in the hundreds, in the thousands?
I think we're talking in the high hundreds, low thousands, I think, Sadat.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, this thing of people being disappeared. That's part of what that is. People and it may not necessarily be the Indians who've done that. There's been some nasty fighting between militant groups as well. Certainly in the early days, there were a lot of people in the JKLF, the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, who were killed because they wanted independence for Jammu and Kashmir, and they were killed by other militant groups who were pro-Pakistan, possibly with Pakistan's encouragement. Let's get rid of the JKLF, we'll use them initially because they're the only organised force, but now we need to impose our will through these pro-Pakistan groups. So there's been some nasty fighting between some of those groups as well.
I don't mean to open up a whole different discussion here, but just to complement what you're saying, I do feel like there might be some parallels to the Palestinian-Israeli situation. So it's like Israel is seen as the main opponent or enemy by the Palestinians, but in addition to that, there's problems between different Palestinian factions as well too, and so it's a very compounded political problem.
Yeah, and people like Burhan Wani, who was killed in 2016, while he didn't like what India was doing, he also didn't like some of the other groups. And there was Zakam Musa, I think his name was. He left maybe the Lashkar-e-Toiba and formed his own group because he was disenchanted with that leadership. And so there's all sorts of personality issues and clashes and within some of these militant groups as well. They're not unified either. But the interesting thing about Palestine is I remember once a former Australian ambassador to Israel saying to me, he said it in a public forum actually, we're having a lecture, he said, the thing about the Palestinians is they need to understand that essentially they've lost They've lost whatever claim they had to all of Palestine. Israel's not going to disappear. They may be able to end up with a small rump territory of Palestine. To some extent, it's the same with the Kashmiris. The Kashmiris need to come to grips with the fact that essentially they've lost, and this, since 2019, the BJP have, to some extent or another, made Kashmiris ordinary Indians. And this is what Kashmiris are going to struggle with. How do we maintain our sense of Kashmiri identity, which is paramount to them? The Kashmiris first, Muslims second, Indians third. And if they went to Pakistan, it would probably be the same. They'd be Kashmiris first, Muslims second, Pakistanis third. And India has essentially made them ordinary Indians now. And at the moment, because we don't know what exactly is going on, but it does seem that things are reasonably peaceful. There's a huge number of tourists have returned to the Kashmir Valley, which is a sign that things are secure enough for them to go out there and spend time and spend money. There are still some killings going on, and the militants have targeted people from outside the Kashmir Valley, but also some Hindus and Pandits. There was a Pandit killed yesterday. He'd returned to the Kashmir Valley and he was working as a bureaucrat. He's been killed, and that's upset lots of people, including Kashmiri Pandits, who've said, we don't feel secure. You're going to have to either provide us with better security or we want to be relocated to Jammu, where they will be secure because it's a Hindu majority area. So there's still lots of challenges up there, but the Kashmiris seem to be perhaps regrouping, or perhaps pausing, or perhaps just coming to grips with the fact that they can't prize themselves away from India. They're going to have to live with and in India. And I say perhaps because I don't know. I haven't been to the valley, and it's so difficult to get information that's accurate about what's going on up there.
Now, before, as you said, the BJP came into power partly on this electoral promise that they were going to revoke Article 370. But before the BJP made this commitment, India had once upon a time made a commitment in 1947 or in 1948 that they would carry out a plebiscite, some kind of a vote or referendum amongst the Kashmiri people to see what it is that they want. Basically, their right to self-determination. Do they want to be a separate homeland? Do they want to be part of Pakistan, or do they want to remain part of India? So as the years go by, obviously, there is less and less hope of such a plebiscite being carried out. But I'm just curious as to what is the reason, because I'm sure that India gives some kind of reason for why they don't carry out that plebiscite. And what do you think of the reason or reasons that they give? I apologize in advance because I know that is one of the chapters or sub-chapters in one of your books, yeah. Understanding Kashmir and Kashmiris. I just wanted to mention this book by Professor Christopher Snedden, and that's just one of 3 books that you've written on the Kashmiri conflict or on Kashmir. But yeah, coming to that plebiscite, I mean, what is that all about and how do you understand that?
Well, Jawaharlal Nehru, when he was Prime Minister of India, and very early on in the Kashmir dispute, a couple of days after the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir had acceded finally to India, so the 26th of October 1947, Nehru and also the Governor-General, Mountbatten, who'd been the previous Viceroy and continued on as the Governor-General, both said we need a reference to the people to confirm that the people of Jammu and Kashmir want to join India. And Nehru believed that they did. And if they had have had that plebiscite then, it's quite possible that the Indians would have won, because the Pakhtun invasion, which had occurred on the 22nd of October 1947, when tribesmen from the Northwest Frontier Province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, invaded the Kashmir Valley and headed for Srinagar, and along the way looted, raped, pillaged all communities, including Muslims, particularly in Baramulla. The Indians might have won. But over time, India became very reluctant to hold this plebiscite, presumably because it thought it wouldn't win, but justified for a number of reasons, one of which was this Constituent Assembly, which, as I mentioned earlier, created the Jammu and Kashmir Constitution and also reaffirmed the Maharaja's accession to India, it said, yes, we reaffirm that Jammu and Kashmir wants to be part of India. But Nehru also justified it by saying in the 1950s that Pakistan had joined some US-led security organisations, particularly CENTO, the Central Treaty Organisation. And he believed that that had changed the dynamics and that Pakistan was looking to militarily invade Jammu and Kashmir and capture it with the support of CENTO forces. Probably highly unlikely, but that's what he believed. And maybe to some extent that was confirmed in 1965 when Pakistan did invade and try to capture militarily Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian held portions. But the third major factor was that the UN Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, reiterated that what they by them were calling a plebiscite should be held. There were only ever two options. Independence was never an option. And the only thing that I've ever found that India and Pakistan agree on in the whole Kashmir dispute is that neither Jammu and Kashmir nor any part of it can be independent. So the UN Security Council reaffirmed that there should be a plebiscite to enable all of the people of Jammu and Kashmir to determine whether the state in its entirety should either join India or stay with India or join with Pakistan. And part of the problem was trying to get the troop numbers withdrawn. The first UN resolution said that all Pakistani forces should withdraw from Jammu and Kashmir, and that Indian forces should then also downsize in numbers and spread throughout Jammu and Kashmir to maintain security while the plebiscite was held. But Pakistan could never agree to that because it felt once it left, those Indian troops would move in and stay in those areas and possibly negatively impact on the poll. In other words, influence people to vote for India. And that remained an issue that continued on for many, many years, and they've never been able to agree to that. And Pakistan doesn't talk about that terribly much, but it is part of the UN resolutions that they were meant to take their forces out and disarm those pro-Pakistan forces. So for a variety of reasons, by about late 1950s, say, India wasn't interested in this plebiscite and hasn't been interested in this plebiscite. And they're still not interested in this plebiscite. So whenever Pakistan raises this issue, almost all nations say, look, it's a bilateral issue. You and Pakistan, you, India and Pakistan, you both need to sort this out. We're not going to get involved because India has made it clear over the years that it is a bilateral issue. And the 1971 similar agreement that came into being after the war between India and Pakistan, the result of which was the creation of Bangladesh and the loss of East Pakistan to West Pakistan, also said that all issues between India and Pakistan are bilateral issues. They needed to be determined by us and nobody else. We're not having any third-party mediation. We're not having any third-party involvement, which included the United Nations Security Council. Now, it did go back to the Security Council briefly after 2019 a couple of times, but they didn't do anything. And it's basically been on the UN list of unresolved issues, and Pakistan every year has to continue to ask for it to be on that list, whereas India, as far as it's concerned, it's not interested at all.
Considering the fact that both of these nations are nuclear powers, there might be good reason for why the international community should be more concerned about this issue.
Yes, and when India and Pakistan look like they're going to war, as happened after the Indian parliament was attacked by Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba militants in 2001, the international community did step in and put a lot of pressure on both nations to try and resolve their issues peacefully. And in the 2000s, 2004 to 7, there was a serious composite dialogue between India and Pakistan when they discussed 8 particular issues. India gave ground by discussing the Kashmir dispute. Pakistan gave ground by discussing India's other 7 issues that they wanted to talk about. And there was almost, apparently, an agreement between General Musharraf, the military dictator, later president of Pakistan, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, that they would resolve the Kashmir dispute. But it didn't happen for a variety of reasons, including Musharraf losing power. So there have been discussions and there's been attempts to resolve this issue, but it's not got very far at all. And the fact that they are nuclear armed is a concern. Now, more recently, of course, China has become heavily involved in this issue on the line of actual control in Aksai Chin that divides what India claims to be part of Ladakh that China controls, and there's serious troop activity up there with numbers increasing and some vitriol between the Chinese and the Indians. And that possibly was because India released some maps in 2019 to show that all of Jammu and Kashmir was part of India. Ladakh is shown as a very huge area going right up to include Gilgit-Baltistan and across to include Aksai Chin and another area called Shaksgam, which China controls as a result of Pakistan ceding to it in 1963. And that possibly is one of the things that upset China. So it's three nuclear armed nations involved in this Kashmir dispute: India, Pakistan and China. So yes, we should be concerned.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for shedding a lot of light on lots of these issues and lots of these questions that I had. For me, I think the main takeaway from this conversation is that it's a very complex situation. It's any kind of just simplistic one-sided view, I think, cannot be taken very seriously. There's lots of intricacies and lots of details, lots of historical details that need to be understood as well. But before we conclude, if there's anything else that you wanted to share, please feel free to do so. I know that in our correspondence, you said that you might have some things to say that my viewers might not like or appreciate. And I said to you that we're interested in the truth and we're interested in the facts. If there's any insight or comments or advice that you have to share, please feel free, and we value your opinion as an academic.
Well, I would just point to this. This is my latest book,
Yes,
called Independent Kashmir: An Incomplete Aspiration, and this is Sheikh Abdullah on the cover, and it does talk about the Kashmiri, by which I mean the ethnic Kashmiri, aspiration for independence. Now, the Maharaja in 1947 seemingly also wanted Jammu and Kashmir to be independent, but he did nothing about actually procuring that independence. He didn't develop a foreign service, for example. Whereas the Maharaja of Travancore, who also wanted to be independent, had started to develop a foreign service, although Travancore eventually joined India. So there's a lot of history, and what I have written is always contested. You can always find somebody who will disagree with you or put a different point of view, and all of that is fine. And that is part of the challenge, actually trying to get to the truth of what has happened or not happened, because certainly in 1947, some of these things weren't terribly well recorded. For example, I mentioned interreligious violence in Jammu province. Well, it wasn't terribly well covered. Most of the focus in 1947 was on the Kashmir Valley, because the Kashmiris have always been the most important homogenous group within Jammu and Kashmir. And certainly by 1947, when Sheikh Abdullah was the leading, or one of the leading politicians, and also Maharaja Hari Singh was in Srinagar, the summer capital. So you go to Srinagar in summer when it's stinking hot down in Jammu, and he was there trying to determine what he would do with Jammu and Kashmir. So the history is contested. There are various points of view. Pakistanis have a different point of view from Indians, and so on and so forth. So try and keep an open mind would be my only advice. And I don't like giving advice because it's not my place to give advice. It's not my dispute. I can understand, I don't necessarily agree, but I can understand all the Pakistani point of view, the Indian point of view, the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And there are various people in Jammu and Kashmir. Some are pro-Pakistan, particularly Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir. Some are very pro-Indian, Jammu and Ladakh in particular, and some in the middle are pro-Pakistan, pro-India, pro-independence. And very difficult to get to the bottom of all of this. But I think, hopefully anyway, I think the most important thing is that people keep communicating with each other and respecting one another and their rights. And eventually, perhaps, we might get to a solution, or perhaps the de facto situation that we have now is the solution. It will just continue the way it is. So thank you, Sadat, very much for allowing me to air my views.
Thank you so much. You said you're not used to giving advice, but those were very wise words. And just to restate, please do check out these books by Dr. Christopher Snedden, The Untold Story of the People of Azad Kashmir, Understanding Kashmir and Kashmiris, which is the one that I have over here, and also his latest book, which he has there, Independent Kashmir, an incomplete aspiration. I like what you said near the beginning of the interview, that when you're in Pakistan, most people viewed you as leaning towards India, being pro-Indian. When you're in India, they see you as being kind of pro-Pakistani. And that's a good indication that you may have struck that balance and maybe achieved that kind of objective balance and view that every academic and serious historian strives to obtain. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your insight. I really appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sadat. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.